It is the 28th of December, and this day in Baptist history. Our reading is Lessons from a Missionary Hero. Our verse of Scripture comes from Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 8. Also I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send? And who will go for us? Then said I, Here am I, send me. Issachar Jacob Roberts was surely one of the most gallant, undaunted, if not valorous missionaries ever to serve under the Baptist banner in the world. To be sure, along with these tremendous characteristics, he was at the same time somewhat erratic. Known by his first two initials, I.J., Roberts had been born in Tennessee on February 17, 1802. At the age of 19, he was converted and baptized, and he entered into studies at Furman Institute in South Carolina to prepare for the work for the ministry. He was ordained to the ministry in Shelbyville, Tennessee on April 27, 1827. Roberts settled in Mississippi where he owned property said to be worth $30,000. That was a considerable amount of money in those days. Being burdened for the mission field of China, in 1836, Reverend Roberts sold his property in Mississippi and formed a mission agency. The funds obtained from the sale of his real estate were contributed for the purpose of sending him to the field. The mission agency was called the Kentucky China Mission Society. But when the funds failed to meet his needs, Reverend Roberts applied to and was appointed by the Triennial Convention on September 6, 1841. The maverick missionary continued to labor as a saddler in China, thus supplementing his salary. A burden gripped the heart of the man of God for the lepers, and he gave himself to ministering to them. Fellow missionaries feared that leprosy was contagious, and Reverend Roberts found himself somewhat isolated from his peers. He wrote in his diary, and I quote, I feel very lonely. The missionaries seldom come to see me, and Brother Percy, to whom I applied for board, thinks we can love each other better apart. End of quote. The next 7 years, the man of God spent ministering between Macau and Hong Kong. In 1844, he established a church in Canton. Leasing a lot, he built a chapel and mission house. He also purchased a floating chapel and maintained worship there. What heartbreak he experienced when a Chinese mob assaulted his house, destroyed the church records, and sank his floating chapel. One of his diary entries at that time read, Preached before breakfast to 18 lepers. I would by no means sell my knowledge of the trade of making saddles, for it makes me independent in my judgment, as I can thus make my own support. On January 1, 1846, Reverend Roberts resigned from the Triennial Convention, and his support was picked up by the Foreign Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. I quote, His labors with the Southern Baptists were generally successful and continued with a reasonable degree of harmony until finally his relations with the convention were dissolved in 1852. End of quote. Tragically, Reverend Roberts was drawn into the Great Chinese Rebellion of 1850-64. The leader of the Taiping Rebellion had studied under Reverend Roberts during his youth. In 1816, Reverend Roberts went to Nanking, the capital of the revolutionists. There he was offered the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs. The man of God refused all civil offices, but accepted the privilege of free access to the rebel territory. In due time, it became apparent to Reverend Roberts that his old pupil was crazy, and he fled from Nanking, narrowly escaping death, and arrived safely in Shanghai. Of course, he denounced the rebels as robbers, and the maverick missionary returned to the United States in 1866. 5 years later, I.J. Roberts died in Upper Alton, Illinois on December 28, 1871. As one might have expected, he died of leprosy. As the time of his departure arrived, he said to his attendant, I shall not be 5 minutes in the dark valley. His caregiver asked, Can you see the heights beyond? With emphasis, God's servant responded, They are so bright that these eyes cannot behold them until they are prepared for the sight. To God be the glory.